Hello and welcome. Today we are making smoky tomato millet soup, and it really is a celebration of the best tomatoes. It's summertime right now, and so we've got some really beautiful tomatoes coming out of the garden or the market. If you don't have the best tomatoes, I'll just say this soup has a bit of a trick that helps them taste sweeter than they are. So don't despair. If you just have some tomatoes, this will make an incredibly nice homemade soup. Step one, you need to get your millet. So millet is an underutilized grain. It is a little bit bigger than quinoa. It looks like little ball bearings, and you just get it soaking. If you soak it a couple hours in advance, that's great. If not, use warmer water and just get it soaking while you're roasting the tomatoes. Okay, so I've got that set aside. To introduce you to the ingredients, the Roma is the best tomato for this soup. It's a sauce tomato, and that just means it has a lot of fiber in it compared to water. So this really is the best one because it's not just going to be adding liquid to your soup. It's really going to be adding kind of like fiber bulk to your soup. That said, any tomato will make a good fresh tomato soup. You could use cherry tomatoes or whatever you have a lot of. Because we're going to be rendering out some of the liquid to concentrate the flavor by roasting these first. The other ingredients are completely just in support of the tomatoes. It really is about the tomatoes. I've got some rosemary and some thyme from my garden. You can use the dried versions if you want. Fresh is great though. Onion and garlic. I'm using a lot of garlic in this recipe. And then I like a smoky thing. I like a smoky tomato soup. Perhaps I use this a lot. You guys have seen me in other videos use it perhaps, but I love smoked paprika because it brings a subtle smokiness, but also paprika itself is a red pepper that's just ground, and it brings a really vegetable kind of grown-up quality to the soup that might not have been there before in the kind of canned tomato soup that you grew up with. It just kind of elevates the canned tomato soup flavor, but you still have that nice, creamy, comforting tomato soup in the end. So let's roast these tomatoes. We're gonna start by preheating the oven. It's at 350. I'm going to cut these into at least quarters or sixths. So I usually, cut them. Sixths are good for this size of tomato, into wedges. Right? And then we're going to get all of our wedges into a bowl. So I've just finished wedging these. Chuck them in here. Now these are at least worth 2 regular cloves of garlic per. And thinly slice, because these little slices are going to cling to the tomatoes. And they're going to roast at the same time as the tomatoes. Now take your tomatoes, add the garlic, and add your herbs. The herbs are going to kind of marinate with the tomatoes in the oven. And if you're picking fresh herbs, you just pull them in the opposite direction of the way the herb grows, if that makes sense, from top to bottom. This is going to be a pureed soup, so if there are a few tiny stems in there, those are okay. But take out the woody stalks. Same with the rosemary. So all the way from the end, oh, that's tender. And then you just pull off the herb that way. Add a little bit of salt, and then we're going to organize it onto our tray. Okay. Salt, olive oil, massage, and this is the tray setup that I use. Okay, so I have a roasting rack, or this is actually an icing rack for icing donuts. I never use it for that. I use it for this purpose. So get an oven rack and layer your tomatoes onto the rack. Now this is going to take out any excess moisture. So even this moisture in the bottom that I've already got, I'm gonna save that and add it to the soup later. So this is just concentrating the sugars in the tomatoes, the whole roasting process. So organize them so that they're not touching too much. Spread them all out. Okay, that's looking good. And into the 350 oven. So over at our pot, we're heating up a little bit more olive oil. And then straight to it, you can add your sliced onion. I've got half of a chipotle pepper. The ones that are in the adobo sauce are a little more mild. If you're using dried peppers, they're a little spicier. And your paprika. I'm using this stuff. And it is sweet and smoky and not spicy, so you're in control of the heat. So all those flavors, and just cook this down. Now I have drained and rinsed the millet, looking like that. And this is what's gonna thicken the soup. So it's not a ton of grains, but it's just enough to make it the right consistency. And you cook all that down until the onions get nice and sweet. Now this is timed out well because the onions are fragrant. And now I can add the liquid. I'm adding the tomato water that came out from those aromas along with some water. And then you can put a lid on this and cook it for 20 to 30 minutes until the millet blooms. And that works out well with the roasting of the tomatoes because I have 20 minutes left on those. So this is what your tomatoes are gonna look like. The skin is a little bit wrinkly on them and they smell divine. And meanwhile, your pot is bubbling away and I see that the grains bloom. You can see them there, it's a little bit blurry. The grains bloom, they just open up and let their starches out. So this is going to be a little bit on the thick side, and you can add water as needed. So just add your tomatoes to this, and then I'll see you at the blending stage. Now, tomatoes vary in how much water that they have, so I've only added the first measurement of water, and then I'll add more as needed. So I'm using a high-powered blender here so that I get a really creamy consistency. Your hand blender will do fine too, it'll just be a little bit more rustic. So season your soup with salt and pepper if you like. And this is the consistency I'm looking for. I ended up not adding any extra water to mine because the tomatoes were a little more on the watery side. And I've got some classic, but more kind of grown up and super healthy tomato soup. Bon appetit. Today we made smoky tomato and millet soup, and you totally can do this.